Good morning, everyone. So this is continuation to the JSON, getting all about JSON. And in this part, what we're going to do is that we're going to get JSON data, but instead of from a local file, we're going to get it from a web service on the internet, all right? So what we've done is that we've created an app, a project, Xcode project. We called it a JSON web service. And in it, in the view controller, all we have in the main storyboard, we're using the main storyboard. In the main storyboard, all I had labels, 4 labels, and I have a button that gets the data. And then what we did, we also created the outlet. So if you click on editor and then we click on assistant, then you'll see we've created all the outlets for all the labels, and we created the action for the function for the button. All right. So how do you go about getting data from a web service? Usually there is a process. Let's go back to the view controller. I'm going to write these processes here so you understand in the header of the class. The first thing you do is that you agree on the data exchange. So assume that you're working with in two different. You're working in a company, and then you're getting data from another company. So before you actually decide on writing the code, you need to agree what kind of information we're exchanging. So that's the first thing. The second thing that you do is that if, let's say, everything after several meetings, you agreed and everything is fine, then you start looking at, you get the API, exchange APIs. APIs are basically nothing for you, is nothing but links. Okay, so now I say, okay, I want to get the data from you, you need to provide for me some APIs, which is basically a URL link. Or if you want data from us, I'm going to give you an API you can call. And an API in this case is a web service and nothing but like a web link with a specific path or a program to call, function to call. In Xcode, after you get exchanged the API, we need to create the structure that represent the data that you want to read, okay? And after that, after you create the structure, the next thing you do is that actually call the API. After that, you will do is that decode the data or parse the JSON data. And then if in case you want to display it, what you do, you'd say display /store/process the information that received. Okay. Typically, this is how the process works. Okay. Now I try to simplify it. It's a simplified process, but those are the major steps in it. Why am I clicking on debug every time I'm clicking on debug? All right. So first, we assume, because we're using an example from the internet, we're assuming that this process is completed, okay, finished. So now what I'm going to do, I got the API, so I'm going to just look at the API and examine what we are receiving in it, okay. Just give me a minute. So where is the API? Where do we get the API from? In our example, we're using GitHub. So I have a URL. So I'm going to take this URL and then examine it. So if I go to my browser and then hit enter, and then I got an error because I have this bracket at the end that does not exist. Did I not do something right here? Hold on, not found. So I got a not found message. Let me go back and make sure I did the right. Okay, so that is the right API. Let's go in here. Oh, I have this quotation at the end. So now I got my data from the web service. Now, obviously, you want to validate the data when you get it. So in JSON, I haven't seen JSON validator, but if you want to create one, it'll be nice. But what we're looking at here, we have all these attributes. We have one, this is a simple JSON. We have one attribute, one object. And then in this object, we have login, we have ID, we have node, blah, 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 all of this. All those are what? All of those are attributes, and then they have values. And just like explained before, the difference between XML and JSON is that JSON allows you to pass data, different data types. And so you can see in here, you have actually different data types. Here is a string, here is a number, maybe integer, here is Boolean, okay? So that is Boolean. Here is a URL. So you can have different data types in JSON, whereas in XML, it will give you just pure strings, all right? So now I decide on what do I want from this data that I received. Now this is public data, so I don't need, I might not need all of them, but when you're working with somebody, with a company, what you do is you decide on the data that you're gonna read. And I just spilled my coffee. Hold on, guys. So now what we're going to do, so we understand, we examine the data. Now we're going to do is we're going back to our project. And the next step, so we've done this part, agree on the exchange data. We couldn't agree because this is what's provided for us as an example. The next part is that we got the API, all right? And then we examine the data, all right? Then the next thing is to create the structure that represents the data. All right, so I'm gonna create the structure. And this structure, I'm gonna call it my structure. You can call it whatever, obviously. And the structure, because it is a JSON, it is a structure that we want to decode the JSON data or parse the JSON data, it has to be decodable. All right, so it's a decodable structure. Now, in this structure, I want to extract the fields that I want. Now, in this case, we decided we wanted to, maybe I want to get the name. I have a field called name. I'm going to get the location. There's a field called location. And I'm going to get the followers, the number of followers. All right. And I'm going to get the avatar URL to show you that you can have a URL object as well. Yeah. And then I'm going to get the public responses. So what you need to do is that you need to take these field names from here and use those as your field names in your structure. So the first one I have is name. So I'm going to copy this guy from here, go back to my code, and I'm going to say let name, and the type of this is a string. And then to be on the safe side, because sometimes you might not get data, you want to make those are optional, all right? And there is another field called location, and I know there is, okay? So I'm gonna say location, And then I'm going to say, okay, location is also is a string, it's an optional. And we have followers. And then this one, if you look at the data, all right, we have input. Let's just, we need to, if we look at the data, what is followers? Followers here is an integer. You can't have a half follower. So my followers is, I just want to make sure it is the same thing. Followers is a string and it's an optional. Okay, why do I get this? Okay, it's gone now. So now if I, the other thing that I want is that avatar URL. And then again, this one is not a string, it's a URL. And the last one is that let public responses, I guess. We don't need that. Okay, just let's do those four fields. I mean, you can, this applies to everything that you want. I mean, if this works, that means any examples that you do this will work as well. All right, so we got our fields. We created our structure. And so that was the create the structure. We created the structure. Then the next thing I want to do is that I wanted to call the API and parse out the JSON data. How do we call the API? To call the API, we need to use the URL session object in Swift. So this allows you to execute a task or a web service and get the result back. Now, in order to do that, we need to create first the URL. Now, the URL will give you either failed or not. You can use guard to do this part. So you can say guard. Instead of if, create the object, if it's equal null, if it is valid, do this. If it's not valid, do something else. So you say guard, let URL equal what? Equal, we create a URL object. And one of the options here is that URL with strength, with the string, all right? So you need to find the URL with the string. And notice this one is what? This one give you, it's an optional. So you might get a null or might not get, or get actual object. So in case you get a null, what do you want to do, all right? So I'm going to select this one. And the string that we have, the URL that we have, is the one that I'm not going to type it, so I'm going to go back to the browser and copy it from here just to be on the safe side. So here's my URL. Because we're using guard, then what do we need to do? So you need to have an else statement with guard. So else, and then you put whatever you want. And then you put the code for the else statement. So if this was successful, skip the else part and go to the next line. Otherwise, I'm going to say print invalid URL. And the next thing I want to do, I'm going to say return. All right. So if it's valid, it will not do this part. It will go to line 52, for example. If it's invalid, what will happen? It will print invalid URL. and it would return, and nothing will happen. All right. So if you have another thing calling this, then basically it will return to that function. Else, what we're going to do, we want to use that. So if it is valid, we're going to do URL session dot share. So I'm invoking, and I want to perform and get the data from the URL that we created. So I'm going to create data task, all right, with the URL. What URL? The one that we created above, which is here, right? But this one has actually a completion handler. What does it mean? You can't see it, but let me just show you again what happens. So when I do this, do you see this one? Data, where you give it a URL and a completion handler. This is the one that we want. The completion handler allow you to what? Examine the data and then check, is it, do you have, did it fail or did it succeed? All right. So if I do this part here, and now I double click here, and I can type in my data here. I type in my response here. And then I type in the object, the error object, okay? All right. And then here's, I am going, oh, the URL is here, URL, and here's my code. So if this was okay, we'll do this part. This is that part, call the API. We're going to call the API. The next thing, if this was okay, I want to check if the data that we got was actually okay and not null. What we want to do, we're going to try to parse out the data. Now, in this example, I'm just showing you how to parse out the data. But remember, when we did this, when I type in a different URL, you still got data, but you got these fields. You got message and decomposition URL, you got actual error message. So in your code, if you want to handle this scenario, you will not get a null, you still get a data. So you need to be able to monitor what kind of objects that you got. Did you get the other object, or did you get this object? All right. So you can do that on your own, but this is to make your example more robust. So after this, the rest is easy, like we've done with the other examples that we've done in JSON. So what we need to do in here, we need to check. Again, you can say if data is not equal to null or nil, what do we do? What do we do if data is not equal to nil? Then we can process. Or you can do the other example, which is what? Guard let data again. Let data equal, you can call it result, so you don't confuse yourself. Result equal data, else again you can put an error message, print. We have to put an not invalid URL. We're going to put something different. We're going to put here command V, invalid, print invalid data. All right, received, or null data received. Okay, and then return. So we're putting we're putting what? We're putting guards against code failure. So the first guard, if the data is, the URL was bad, the next guard is if the data is bad that we've received. If it's not, if it is good, then the next step is to what? To parse the data. And to parse the data, the JSON code, remember when I said that if you're getting different JSON data, you need to do something about it. This is the part where you do something about your JSON. If it is an error, you got data, but you don't know what type of data, right? So here's what we do. We can say do. And the reason we have a do object, like I explained in the previous video, is that you need to have do object, do and try, because when you parse the data into the JSON structure that we got, it might fail. So you need try and catch, all right? And let's take care of the error first. And I'm gonna say print error parsing JSON data, all right? So this is the third protection here. So we got the guard against the bad URL, guard against the empty data. Now the last thing, what if the JSON data that you receive does not match the object, the structure that I've created? Maybe the field names are not correct, or I made a mistake with the type of these fields. So this is how you guard your code. So now, so this is the part about catching the data, the error. Now the last part is that we need to decode the JSON data. So let decoder equal JSON decoder. Now we use this decoder, JSON decoder, trying to convert the data, which is called result, into the structure that we've created. If this was successful, then we will go to the next. If this was successful, we're okay. If it's not successful, then you display invalid data. So let's check it out, see what happens. So I'm gonna say let that was JSON data equal try what? Decoder dot decode. What do we want to decode? We want to decode the structure, decode the decode into the structure, which is my structure, right? All right, so my structure dot self, because it belongs to this object, and then the data that we want to put is actually result. It's been a busy morning. So what does that do? This will try to convert the result data that we received into a JSON object. If this failed, because we said we're going to try, if this failed, it'll go to the catch. That means if it fails, that means the JSON data you received does not match the structure definition. All right. So, or there's a problem with the JSON data that we received. All right. So here's where you can play around with your different type of JSON data you get, or error messages. Otherwise, for now, I'm just going to print it, and then later on when we test it, make sure, then we will put it in the label. So if I say print, let's just print one of them. Okay, we say print, and then I'm going to say what we wanted to print. I'm going to say result, name, and then I'm going to say here / name. No, we're going to say the JSON data dot name, right? And you might get an error, so you want, because it's an optional, we need to unwrap it. All right. Okay, so that will give you the, at least to test it, to see if we have an if it worked or not. So I'm gonna also, since we're using the error object here, I'm gonna print out what kind of error we are getting. So we know exactly what the error are we getting. All right. So if the data, first get the URL, execute a session with task, and then do the code, catch the error, try to convert the data, and then we have catch. The last thing that we have, actually we did not include, is that we need to do resume. So this one is for this one is for that, this one is for this, and then this is the code for, and okay, and this one here, we need to put resume, because what I was saying that you're getting data from the internet, and this function might pause, might get stuck, or might get interrupted. So you need to do the resume to make sure that this continues until the request is completed from the server. All right. Okay, let's test it and see how it works. So if I run this, let me show this on the bottom. Taking a little bit of time. Let me just pause it so we're not waiting. All right, so what happens here, we got, when I did that, when we ran it and I hit this, actually we got a JSON error, all right? We got a error parsing JSON data. This is that last message that we did in here, error parsing the JSON data. And then we're saying that the problem is that when you're trying to decode, the problem is when you keep decoding it, it's telling you that you have data mismatch. And then the reason is, it's saying, okay, wait a minute, for the followers, you have int value, but you are getting, so there's a problem with the followers. So what do we do with this in this scenario? What we need to do, we need to go and check, do I have, let's look at the followers. What do I have in here? I have a string. But what am I getting from the URL? I'm getting followers is an integer. So it caught the problem before we actually tested. And you'll do this many times to make sure that your code is valid and that you're not getting errors. There's not data mismatch between your structure definition and your data you're getting from the server. So what do I need to do? Instead of this, we need to change this to an integer, because I'm not getting a string, I'm getting an integer. Okay, so let's test it again and make sure it works. If I click on get data, so I got the name, no errors, so I'm fine. Now I need to update those labels with the data that we've received. All right, so I'm gonna stop. I'm just gonna pause for a minute and then let's test that part. Okay. All right, so the problem that the error that we got is because you have the main thread, the main process that is running, that you're interacting with, which is your UI, the user interface, whatever you interact with the user. And that usually run on a much, much faster thread. And then you have another thread. Every time you do this, this is running in the background. So what you need to do in order to access the the main thread from this background thread, you need to say, I want you to add an operation to the main thread. And the way you do that, you put, you use operation Q, main add operation, okay? And that will add a task to the main thread. And this is typically what you need to do when we deal with getting data from the background, and then you want to update the front end. All right. So now what happens is that you can say here Command V, and then Q operation, the main thread, and I want to add a task to this main thread. What is the task that you want to update? You want to update the UI elements. All right. So if it was successful. So here I can do the name, then I can do self dot lbl location equal JSON data dot location, and then you can do self dot lbl followers equal JSON data dot followers. But because of followers is what? Because the follower is, and by the way, these are all, you want to put the text value, right? That text. Because a follower is actually an integer, and this is a string, what can you do? You can trick it, just put it like this, okay? And then put that like that, that will convert it to a string. All right? So now let's test it and see what happens. All right, you can fix this. I haven't done that, but you can fix this yourself, okay? Well, we need to, it's a null, so we need to make sure that it is unwrapped. Yeah, it's an optional. All right. So now if I run it, and I click on get data, and I got my information from the server, right? So that's your example. The steps, which put them on above, you create, you decide, get the data exchange, examine the API, get the API, look at the data. We created the structure based on the data that we've got. The next thing we need to do is that you create the URL, invoke the API, get the URL, you execute the shared task session. The response is either you get data, the response is for session communications, you get an other, or you get an error. If the result that we got, there's no result that we got, all right? Sorry, if there's no data we received, then we get, we say no data received, null data received. Otherwise, if the data is okay, we try to decode the data that we've received into the structure that we created above. If this was successful, if we're using API, if we're using, we're updating the UI elements, we need to add this to the main task, or the main thread. We updated, and that would be all right. If we didn't get, when we try to parse the data and we got an error, we say catch error, and then we're saying data, and that's what we got, what we had with our example. All right. So that is it. So this is an example how to get data from a web service and parse out the data. This is what should be, for your sake, this should be, for most cases, this will give you almost 80% of what you need to do to invoke a web service on the internet. All right. Any question? I think we're done. Okay.